All right, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is our final week together. Congratulations, you have made it. And this week we're going to be talking about hate crimes and hate crime victimization. So this is a very relevant topic, one of my favorite topics that we'll talk about. So as always, please make sure you take notes. I will timestamp this for you, and let's get started. So I want to ask you a question. Do you know who these people are? Take a look. These are the victims of the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue shooting. And essentially this happened in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where a man armed with an AR-15 assault rifle and at least 3 handguns entered the synagogue shouting anti-Semitic slurs and openly fired on a Saturday morning. He killed at least 11 congregants, wounding 4 police officers, along with 2 additional people being wounded. What about these individuals? Do you recognize them? Well, these are the victims of the 2022 Tops Friendly Market massacre in New York City. And essentially what happened was a white male went into a predominantly African American marketplace and opened fire, killing these individuals. He did it because he did not like black people. What about these individuals? These individuals are the victims of the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. The Pulse nightclub was a predominantly gay and lesbian nightclub, and on June 12th of 2016, a gunman opened fire and killed 49 people and wounded at least 50 more, because there is some controversy with the Pulse nightclub shooting. I'll be completely transparent. It is thought to be a hate crime. However, there are those that say that it is not a hate crime, that it was based on something else. What about these 3 victims? These are the victims of the Dollar General shooting in Jacksonville, Florida last year. A masked white man fatally shot 3 black people inside a Jacksonville, Florida Dollar General store in a predominantly African American neighborhood. He had a gun that had a swastika painted on it, and he had posted racist writings before killing himself. Now, what about these 3 individuals? These 3 individuals are the victims, I believe it was in Vermont, of shooting, where they were walking down the street coming back from a grandmother's house, and a man who was shouting anti-Muslim sentiment shot them. They survived, but it is the most recent hate crime that has happened. This happened while I was developing our hate crimes class in November of this past year. So I always start this out with victims because I think it's important for us to see the faces behind the hate, and the victims behind the hate. All too often we focus on the perpetrators and kind of why they do what they do, but these are innocent victims. Now, the media sensationalizes hate crimes. I will be the first to tell you that. This is the most recent FBI statistics to show the prevalence of hate crimes. In 2022, there were a little over 11,000 hate crimes that was committed. And you will see that the majority of hate crime victims are based off of race, ethnicity, and ancestry. So the majority of hate crime victims tend to be African American. Uh, However, religious-based hate crime, so your anti-Semitic, your Islamophobia, all of that has slowly started to creep up to kind of be in a very close second with sexual orientation as a leading motivating factor. So you can see these, we're going to come back to this in a little bit and kind of talk about it a little more. When you're talking about hate crimes, we typically think that they are very prevalent. And while hate crimes are rising, they don't make up a lot of our total crime in the United States. They don't occur at the same pace. In fact, they're very rare compared to other crimes. So the UCR data kind of shows us there was 11 plus million total crimes in 2022, and hate crimes were only generated about 11,000 of those crimes. However, hate crimes are very different in the victimization because victims are representative of a prejudiced group and they're specifically targeted. And they're often specifically targeted for something they can't change and have no control over. The fundamentals of hate crimes also include the distinctive manner in which it causes harm. Victimization can be physical, but if you're a hate crimes victim, there's a lot of emotional and psychological victimization that goes on there. It's important to note that victims are targeted because of a perceived attribute that is an essential element of their identity. They cannot change that element. You cannot change skin color. You cannot change sexual orientation. You cannot change disability. You can't change religions. And so that victimization is very personal. In the fact that there are attributes they can't change. However, victimization can be impersonal in that specific person may not be targeted, but it's what that person represents that is the targeted true victim. So what are hate crimes? Well, there are two elements to a hate crime. The first is you have to have a crime. There has to be a crime that is committed in order for it to be a hate crime. This is where we kind of get into the debates around hate speech, and you're going to read about hate speech, but if there is not a crime committed, there isn't a hate crime. And so the other element that we have to have is motivation. And that motivation has to be based on bias. And I will tell you that hate crimes are the only crimes in which motive has to be proven in order for it to exist. Now, in most criminal trials, we lack motive, but motive is not necessarily a required element. However, in hate crimes, it is a required element. So essentially, hate crimes must include both a crime and hate. And motivation is hard to prove. So essentially, we use evidence. So circumstantial evidence a lot of the times plays a factor in proving motivation. If they have written on social media, if they have shouted bias comments during the commission of the crime, like the one individual who had the swastika painted on his gun, and he was a white supremacist, things like that, all are taken into consideration when we're trying to prove motive. I will also say with hate crimes, a lot of these are sentencing enhancers. And so when we're talking about hate crimes charges, we're talking really truly at the federal level about enhancing sentence length. So if someone is found guilty of capital murder and then also guilty of a hate crime, the hate crime adds years to the sentence of capital murder. You don't really see someone charged with a hate crime in and of itself. It's typically an enhancement crime. So Gordon Allport was a social psychologist who wanted to understand why hate happens, why hate itself happens. And we understand that hate has a root in prejudice, and prejudice kind of leads to hate. And so I'm going to give you a quick overview of this. We go more in detail in other classes. But essentially, Allport gave us this scale of prejudice that kind of shows us how hate or how prejudice leads to hate and discrimination and ultimately physicality. So let me get my pointer, and hopefully you can see this. So at the very base of the scale of prejudice is the antilocution stage. And essentially the antilocution stage is expressing prejudice among like-minded friends and family. I don't want to say it's not as severe, but it's essentially not advertising the prejudice. You're with like-minded individuals. This is where microaggressions come in and things like that. There's not a lot of hostility in the antilocution stage. You don't really see the physical aspects of hate kind of come about in the antilocution stage. But those individuals can graduate to the next level called avoidance. So with antilocution, if you surround yourself with like-minded individuals who have prejudices and biases, you are more likely to socialize with individuals who are like-minded. And so when you're starting to come out of that family and friends group and actually widening the net, you're starting to see avoidance. So avoidance is essentially taking deliberate action to avoid the group that you have prejudice against. So the prejudiced victim may not really be aware of your prejudice, but you are very much aware that you don't want to be in the room with that group. So I will give you an example. Let's say you and your family despise gay people, gay men, and you have prejudices and biases against gay individuals. And so in your family group, you talk about how society is going downhill because gay and lesbian, transgender individuals are becoming more predominant and getting rights. At that point, you're in the antilocution stage. Now, if you are out and about and you run into a store that you start seeing transgendered individuals in. So you notice that there are some transgendered individuals in a certain aisle. You avoid that aisle at all costs, or any aisle that they walk down, because of your biases that you believe in. That's the avoidance stage. You do not go anywhere where that group is likely to be. However, that's not always possible. And so the best way I know to describe this is um, if you hold those beliefs, you are inevitably going to be in a situation with those individuals. So I always talk about white supremacists and African Americans. Let's say you were raised as a white supremacist and you have avoided being in any type of social setting with a black person. You come to college and you don't have a choice but to be in social settings with African Americans. And so what happens when you're in that social situation, when you can't avoid being in there? Maybe you are put in a group project with an African American and you're a white supremacist. Well, you're going to start taking action and overtly discriminating against that individual. This is the next rung of the scale of prejudice. Discrimination is when we start taking deliberate action to deny members of rights or social equality. This is the first stage where the victim starts to recognize that some action is happening that they are being prejudiced against. Discrimination can also lead to physical violence, and physical violence is our actual physical attacks, threats, assaults, things like that. The prejudice kind of intensifies, and then that can lead to extermination. Extermination is essentially like the Holocaust. We don't see many extermination scenarios happening. You typically see it going all the way up to the physical attack aspect, but after that, it can lead to extermination. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about some of our basic roots of how to define motive and kind of how prejudice, understanding how prejudice will conceptualize through this continuum, let's actually talk about hate crimes themselves. So what is a hate crime? Well, we said that in order to have a hate crime, you had to have a crime and you had to have bias motivation. But bias motivation against who? What is the actual legal definition of a hate crime? Because the word hate can be misleading. When hate is used in a legal definition, it doesn't mean rage, anger, or general dislike. Instead, it means bias against a protected group that is protected by law. So the U.S. Department of Justice says that a hate crime is a criminal offense against a person, property, or society that is motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and national origin. Now, this is the federal statute. We know that we have federal laws, but we also have state laws. And so state laws don't always align. Well, they align, but they don't always agree systemically across the United States. In fact, we see a lot of variances in state laws, such as California adds the word association. So someone can be charged with a hate crime if they are associates of an offender committing a hate crime and they knowingly kind of know that that crime is being committed. New York adds some additional protections around religion and religious practices to the protected groups. And then Utah's statute is very broad, and it includes notable emphasis on intimidation of the victim. So Utah will talk about intimidating a victim of this class based off of the motive that they're a member of this class. So it doesn't have to be an actual physical offense like a physical attack, it can be intimidation. So we see various state laws, but overall, this is your definition, federal definition of a hate crime. So hate is nothing new. The country has been dealing with hate since its foundation. African Americans and slavery have been fighting for recognition of individuality and equal rights throughout history. You've learned about it. If you get a chance to take my hate crimes class, we talk about that. But it really wasn't until the civil rights movement that we started to really kind of formulate protections around discrimination. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a historic piece of legislation that really laid the foundation for future hate crime laws. And essentially, it did two things. It targeted and sought to discourage discrimination at the federal level, and it prohibited governments from denying access to protected classes. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 essentially was our huge piece of discrimination legislation. There had been some civil rights acts before then, but this was revolutionary. Now, the Civil Rights Act did not expressly talk about hate crimes. We did not really see the word hate crime originate until the 90s. What happened really was you had the civil rights movement that lasted in the 60s and 70s. And then in the 80s, you had the war on drugs, but you also had the AIDS pandemic that happened. It was largely blamed on gay men. And so there was an increase in discriminatory practices around the LGBTQ plus community through the 80s. And it really wasn't until the early 90s that we started to firmly take a stance on hate crimes themselves. And in fact, there was one piece of legislation that's on your screen right now. It's called the Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1991. And essentially, this was the first time the term hate crimes had been used in any federal legislation. And this piece of legislation essentially required the U.S. Attorney General to gather statistics around hate and bias crimes. We needed to get a handle on how prevalent these crimes were. And so the HCSA essentially required at a federal level for these reporting standards to be put in place. And today we have a separate portion of the UCR that gathers information specifically on hate crimes that you can go in and look at year over year. It's a great tool when studying hate crimes. Now, I want to take you on a timeline. Civil Rights Act of 1964 put in place discriminatory protections for protected classes. The Hate Crime Statistics Act was in the early 90s, and it started to recognize that these crimes needed to be tracked and monitored in order to understand the true prevalence. HCSA was the first time that the terminology hate crime had been used, but it was not until 2009 with Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act that we truly had a federal hate crime statute, meaning it was not until 2009 that hate crimes became a federal offense. Let that sink in. It took realistically Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. dying due to being victims of hate crimes in nearly 50 years for us to truly solidify the protections for hate crime victims. And so the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act does just that. It is the piece of legislation that created a federal hate crime statute. And it created new protected classes. So you had race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, all of that. But it wasn't until 2009 that gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability were added to the protected classes of hate crimes. All right. So we've talked kind of about what is a hate crime, what's the definition of a hate crime. We've talked about some of the legislation around hate crimes. Now let's turn our attention to the perpetrators of hate crimes. So I want to ask you a question. When you hear hate crime perpetrator, what image comes into your head? I want you to picture it. If you hear that someone committed a hate crime, what does that person look like in your head? Do they look like this? Do they look like this? Twos? How about this? What about these pictures? These two pictures are actual hate crime perpetrators. Now, I will say when I do this activity, a lot of people will say, think of men in white hoods, white old men with no teeth, or tattoos, things like that. Robert Geddes was an Iowa man who was convicted of a hate crime for leaving threatening notes on homes with pride flags and making threats toward the gay individuals that lived in those homes. Russell Henderson and Aaron McKinney are the two perpetrators that murdered Matthew Shepard. They essentially, if you don't know about Matthew Shepard, they essentially picked him up at a bar and in Wyoming. So there's nothing in Wyoming. It's a lot of land. Essentially took him to the middle of nowhere, beat him severely, tied him up to a fence, and left him to die. He was found the next day. And essentially was found bound on the fence by a biker and died 10 days later. The reason that they gave was gay panic, and essentially their defense was this gay panic defense that said he hit on us, so we didn't know what to do but to kill him. And so that was really the first time that we had heard of this gay panic defense, and really kind of a discriminatory defense being accepted. They were later convicted of the murder, and I believe one of them was put to death and one of them was given life in prison. Know about hate crime perpetrators? Well, those pictures that you had in your mind are probably not typical offenders. In fact, there is no typical hate crime offender. I can't point to someone and say, oh, that person is going to do a bias-motivated crime, just by the way that they look. However, we do have some characteristics of those who have committed hate crimes. So we do know that when someone does commit a hate crime, they typically are young white males. They do not come from an impoverished background. They have little to no contact with the CJ system and are not part of a hate group. However, with that being said, offenders range in age family dynamic background. They come from both upper and lower class socioeconomic classes. They're essentially ordinary members of the public. So there is no typical offender or a typical offender typology. So why do people commit hate crimes? We talked about Allport's scale of prejudice and kind of how prejudice will eventually evolve into discrimination and physical attacks. Well, two social scientists, Levin and McDevitt, exclusively studied hate crime offenders. And they found that there were certain typologies that could describe the motivation behind the offenders. The first one was the thrill-seeking offender. And this offender is one who seeks to experience excitement from hurting others. And they're in it for the excitement. The thrill-seeking is the most common motivation, and it's almost always young individuals or individuals in small groups. We do know that the thrill-seeking perpetrator almost always leaves their own neighborhoods and purposely seeks out the victim somewhere else. And really kind of how to differentiate it from other typologies is that the entire attack was for the sheer excitement of the attack. Now, the next offender typology is the defensive offender. These are crimes where perpetrators are reacting to what he or she considered to be an intrusion. So neighborhoods, if they consider immigrants coming into their neighborhoods and taking over, and they lash out because of that, that could be considered defensive. We typically see offenders don't leave their own neighborhood because they feel like they're protecting what is theirs in the defensive category. These are perpetrators that typically have no criminal history and are not typically involved in hate-related activity. You're going to see that the majority of offenders are not part of hate groups, and hate groups really only make up about 15% of overall hate crimes. So these are really, hate crime offenders are really lone wolves due to one of these. The final category for Levin and McDevitt is the retaliatory. And these are individuals who perceive that an attack has occurred on one of their own. These are individuals in which they hear a report or rumors of a hate incident against his or her own group and takes revenge by committing a crime against a member of the initial offending group. So the retaliatory is really to get even. Levin and McDevitt came back in 2002 and actually added an additional typology. And it is not on the screen, so please make sure you write this down. But that typology is known as the mission offender. And the mission offender is the most dangerous offender in hate crimes perpetration. And the reason that is because these are typically mentally ill individuals who believe that it is their purpose to rid the world of this group. And so mission offenders will leave lots of circumstantial evidence. They will have writings, they will have manifestos, things like that. So I touched on this a little bit, but most people, when they hear of hate crimes, think of hate groups, like the KKK. However, these are not the majority of perpetrators of hate crimes. Again, they make up about 15% of hate crime perpetrators. and are really super, I won't say super rare, but they're not the common perpetrators when we're talking about hate crimes. When we talk about hate crime perpetrators, we're really talking about individuals taking it into their own hands. So you can see the definition of hate groups. I'm not going to read that to you, but I wanted to make sure that I included this because it's a common myth when we talk about hate crimes that hate groups are the main perpetrators. So let's look at some victimization trends. Now, we use the National Crime Victim Survey data tool to really kind of collect information around hate crimes. We also have the UCR's hate crimes component that is not required for law enforcement to report to. They're not required to report hate crime statistics. So it can get a little skewed, but our NCVS data is the most realistic because that's talking to victims. So there was a study completed looking at NCVS data to compare historical hate crimes data to more current data. And so researchers looked from 2000 to 2003 and found that there were about 210,000 victims themselves, and hate crime victims were about 191,000. Compared that to 2007 to 2011, you'll see that the hate crime victims went up. They went from 191,000 to 194,390. And there were some characteristics that we could pull out of that. So from the 2000 to 2003 data, we saw that the majority of hate crime victims had weapons used in their victimization. Racial bias was the most common, still the most common type of hate crime motivation is racial bias, along with ethnic bias. And finally, less than half of the victims reported their victimization. So that's pretty steady around interpersonal victimization, but there's a lot of issues around why hate crime victims don't report. And so what we see with that is they may report to law enforcement, they may report to some other social institution that kind of helps walk them through their victimization. So compare this to 2007 to 2011 data. We see that all racial bias decreases, still the leading bias. Religious bias doubled. And so that's your anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crime motivation. We also saw a stark increase in violent victimizations with hate crimes, as well as reporting to police decreased. So this kind of gives you a little bit of some trends around hate crimes. We start to see them, they consistently increase year over year. Motivation overwhelmingly is anti-African American motivation, but that number two slot for motivation is either religious bias motivation or sexual orientation motivation, and they flip-flop. With world events going on right now, it's not surprising to see that religious bias is a motivating factor. We see a stark increase in anti-hate crimes. In fact, in the 2022 year, there was a 12% increase in just anti-Semitic hate crimes, and then I think it was like a 10% increase in Islamophobic hate crimes. So as we've politicized hate, we start seeing these victimizations rise. Here's your 2022 data. We've gone over this before, but I'll kind of leave this and let you look at it. You'll see that number 2 and number 3 slot for motivation Again, it tends to fluctuate between religious bias and sexual orientation, but race, ethnicity, and ancestry is overwhelmingly. African Americans are overwhelmingly the victims of hate crimes. And here is just kind of a breakdown of that pie chart so you could see year over year. So you'll see in 2021, there was a little over 10 and a half or 10,500 reported incidents of hate crimes. And in 2022, there was over 11,000. And so you'll see that while race, ethnicity, and ancestry motivation decreased year over year, it decreased by like 1%. You saw massive increases in religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, especially. And that's not shocking based off of our social dynamics that have been going on during COVID and things like that. Concludes the presentation on hate crimes. I hope you all have a great week, and if you need anything, feel free to reach out.